Hello, how's everyone doing? Amazing. I am very, very happy to be here. What a place in the world. Gorgeous. It truly means a lot to get to participate in the event. Shout out to James, Jane, the organization, for bootstrapping and building community around this very pressing set of topics and bringing people together in order to come up with better solutions. That was a very long intro. Thanks, Jane. I'm sorry for putting all those words in there. This is me. I come in multiple configurations of hair and beard that shift quite a bit. It's all the same person. I work at Control Plane. That is a security consultancy focused primarily on highly regulated industries, critical national infrastructure, and financial services. Uh, we do a lot of offensive security in order to help strengthen defense, trying to apply combining red teaming to purple teaming. Also, we do a lot of audit and assurance. It has been almost a compulsion of mine in recent years, helping organizations rethink holistically about how to meet their compliance and regulatory objectives through code. And what is compliance ultimately? It's are we doing what we said we will do? But how many screenshots of spreadsheets can you provide to demonstrate that? There's got to be a better way. Sure, we've started to express policy as code, and there's plenty of room to iterate and be the best version of the organization, help metabolize the consumption of platforms, applications, products in order to provide better services, do so securely, avoid getting breached. Some of the public works I've written, I'd encourage you to check out some of these references. One is the Supply Chain Best Practices Guide, a lot of policy in there, defining policy in order to protect the supply chain, the software supply chain, from incidents like the SolarWinds breach of recent years and other high profile attacks of that sort. Also, complementary to that, the software factory reference architecture. It's a opinionated approach to ensuring that supply chain controls are in place using best of breed, the most mature, the most feature complete open source projects that are out there. Also, quite interesting to the track. If you follow DevOps, you might have seen the definitive book, The Phoenix Project. Recently gathered with another set of authors to do a sequel to the book. So it's a novel, a little business erotica, may not be for everyone, but it's the story of a financial services organization receiving a matter requires attention from the Office of Comptroller of Currency in the United States. And what unfolds from there, how do they react, and how do they manage to bring the organization together? Different groups have been operating as silos, uh, attempting to do DevSecOps, but also ensuring that compliance and audit get brought along the way, as opposed to being an adversarial set of gatekeepers, ensuring that they can all fulfill their compliance objectives. Real quick on the company, once again, I talked about it, glossed over it. We're security specialists on cloud, Kubernetes, containers, and open source. Clients, once again, organizations in highly regulated industries. We're a relatively small company. We're 50 people. We're headquartered in London, and we have offices in New York and Oakland. So the author of the talk, I'm actually delivering this talk on behalf of someone else, gentleman by the name of Chris Nesbitt Smith. Chris works for the UK Crown Prosecution Service. A lot of the art, a lot of the slides you're going to see were produced by him. And when we got together and we're going over the material, we landed at okay, policy is actually quite a dull thing. How do we make this compelling? How do we make it interesting? So I'll bear with me. I'll try my best to get your attention. Um, Chris hired an artist for the following act, and this is Chris. This is not me. We have a little contention of whether we call this a lift or an elevator. Yes, we call them elevators, not lift in North America. So Chris walks into the elevator, and people follow right behind him. And he thinks, okay, Chris, this is your moment, now or never. As the door closes, he positions himself at the door. He's got a captive audience. They're his. He takes a breath. He looks to the first person on his left. That person's in a suit. They look very important. He gestures at them. They look back as to say, sure, Chris, go on. Oh, you must be the CIO, the policymaker, the one whose neck is on the block. What are the chances of finding you in my imaginary elevator today? And Chris asks her, so what's keeping you up at night? And she says, I don't know what teams are really doing. What volume of risk can I take? And what should I show more interest in? Setting and changing policies is slow and hard to communicate. People just go off, do their own thing. They think they know better. And to be honest, they often do. But I'm left playing catch up with the risk they've signed me up to. Okay, I'm not going to be a patronizing snake oil salesman, but I can help. Managing risk, mostly opportunity risk, the fear of missing out, so getting features out the door, avoid getting bogged down on. Everyone like looks back at the CIO as she goes on. Bureaucracy that's designed to slow me down. Okay, great. This is your lucky day. He turns on to the next person. They're dressed in overalls. As a hip part of town, could be Brooklyn, could be posh part in London, Shoreditch. They could be the CTO. He thinks. Before he addresses them, they immediately turn to him and say, "Hi, I am the maintenance person here." And Chris is like, "Wait, how come you're in my imagination right now? Hang tight, I'll get back to you straight away." His attention goes to the next person. They're wearing hoodie, got their headphones on around their neck, and he's like, right, stereotypical developer. I know you very well. So he asks, what code do you write? Is it Go? Is it Rust? Is it Python? And they go, cool, you got everything updated to work with. Perhaps if you do Python 3, that must be really hard. They don't know it yet, but he built rapport with them. He's connected, and they say, yeah, like staying hard on patching dependencies, staying on top of it, so we can always react to the next fire, knowing what rules exist, which ones can I bend, which ones can I break, what might cost me to lose my job. It's a struggle to write consistent, good quality code, avoiding technical debt, and the rest of my team to follow along and work cohesively as one. So, hey, do you use any tools that I can help you with? Chris asks. And they say, yeah, for sure. Linters, code quality, test coverage tools, the usual. Great. I write code too. Let's be friends. Hand them a printed QR code with a public GPG key so they know they can trust the communications and what Chris says. And he brings the focus back to the cleaner. It's like, okay, I got it. I know what you're doing here. Like, you get told what to do and when it changes. How does that happen? Oh, we get a memo, something stuck on the wall. Just like last week, we got one saying that all whiteboards and all meeting rooms needed to be cleaned every night. Okay, How does that work out? Well, it's up to us to maintain the new to-do list so we can onboard new people on the cleaning team. Does that ever go wrong? Yeah, sometimes when we compile our operational manual, we miss a memo or don't apply it in the right sequence and we get things wrong. So glancing over at the person who seems to be the product manager, and the cleaner goes on to say, well, like when we hadn't updated the guide that the meeting room on the third floor was being used as a dedicated war room, and we wiped all the whiteboards. Getting back at the developer, it seems to sound familiar to them, so they're nodding. Like, turns out we're not all special snowflakes in the way we go on about things. But not all is lost. Like, good reason the person asserted whether there. The lift's starting to slow down, almost arriving at its destination. It's like, okay, I may have a silver bullet for you all. And the CIO looks back, ready to buy whatever that Chris is selling. And as the doors open, is like, but wait, who are you? And as he moves out to not stand in the way, not obstruct getting people into the office, it's like, well, I'm really here just to fix the lift. People have been complaining it only goes to the top floor, no matter what button they push, and it's actually pretty slow. And they're all like, what? They storm out, furious. They head towards the stairs. The door shuts, and he carries on, goes back to his job. So that act, does that sound familiar to you in any way? And if you can relate to any of them, we may have some answers to you for you. So what if I could say you could update policy easily, even even releasing several versions, not just in 1 year or a month? What about 10 updates to the policy a day? And seamlessly communicate what people need to consume without derailing them, how to best operate safely, how to attain that promise of the cloud of developer productivity, operational efficiency, without being bogged down by audit. You could have visibility on all the compliance tools that the organization uses, and that policy would be readily consumable, easy to parse. You'd be able to demonstrate compliance, make sense, and not be bogged down about bureaucracy at time of change when it needs to be and not get in the way. That same policy could be used by developers as a dependency and operate like a linter, so you can run compliance checks locally in your continuous integration pipeline on guard protection ultimately. That multiple versions of that policy as dependencies are supported. So when emergencies happen, and you must update now because there's a security advisory of a new critical vulnerability, think Log4j, and everything must be updated. It's not a fire drill, but that act of responding to the incident is now business as usual, and it doesn't cause as much chaos. Like, okay, cool, right on. All of that sounds quite promising. So, by show of hands, who is with the set and like written or applied a policy before here in the room? Okay. Who of you have consciously sought exemption, conspicuously bent, broken, circumvented, ignored, bypassed whatever that policy was with the best of intentions? Okay. Typically, I take my phone out and snap a real picture real quick, just to raise the stakes. We got your names on your badges. We know who you work for. We can send it to your company. So you fell for it. Thank you. Not going to use that, actually. And as you see, I didn't take the picture. So where do I see policy going wrong? There's just to agree on terminology, because policy means different things to different people. Here's a commonly accepted definition: a set of ideas or a plan of what to do in particular situations that has been agreed to officially by a group of people a business organization, a government, or a political party. That policy usually comes down in two forms. One, security, like data at rest for your platforms has to be encrypted, or all traffic before it hits the wire must be encrypted at a application layer for data and motion protection. The other type is consistency, such as code style. There are other types that you could think of, but broadly, those two are intended to mitigate risk of some sort, prevent something bad from happening. In the case of cyber, a breach. In the case of consistency, it's all about people doing things repeatedly, driving down cost, not drifting too far off on their own way, uh, not going on uninformed adventures. Although those two sets, no matter intentions, are typically emotionally led and are not really rooted or anchored on controls, and that opens the door to case by case exemptions. Whatever policy exists, it's hindering productivity. And we often need to reach out to the policy stakeholders to approve an exception for us. Every time there's a situation the policy hadn't contemplated at the time that it was written. It's a lot like laws of the land, with like case laws make very complex, very broad rule books for attorneys to navigate. And it's really hard to measure compliance in court. It often looks like a thin wedge, as you see in the picture, where a precedent, which may have been an uncomfortable pill to swallow the first time, becomes very dangerous with others as they start to expand the scope of that new precedent, which puts us in a place of asking, is the cure actually worse than the disease? Are these policy changes and exemptions and the way that we reason about it are actually something that gets us into splitting hairs, that gets us frustrated, that make us have a lot of unnecessary conversations rather than the way that we described and defined the policy in the first place. But if you map that to how developer teams work, this is not how software gets built, at least not typically. Like the way that people go from gathering requirements, turning those client requirements to a functional spec and to a set of engineering tasks to execute against is very different to how we've described about policy changes getting made. So why don't we take some of the best elements of agile, DevOps, pick your modern software development methodology and framework? How about we marry those two a little bit? We've codified everything else up to date already. So if that isn't the answer of expressing policy as code, then what would it be? So, in part, it is the point of the talk that we've started to do that somewhat, but perhaps the best approach is cargo culting a lot of the thinking of policy, and we may be doing it wrong. You can think your favorite product name, scream it at me as the solution. And yes, there's a lot of tooling out there that can help the organization start to solve the problem to a certain degree. And like, you're not wrong, but the devil's in the details here. Throwing some curly braces around the statement doesn't inherently fix things. Just making the policy code is not the silver bullet. If it is a security control that we're defining, is often ideal to keep that policy we just wrote as a secret. Exposing it or sharing it is something that could get in the hands of a competitor or worse, an adversary that can turn around and use it against you. And we hear a lot in recent times around shifting security left, but it doesn't really support that. It results in developers who are having to already think about performance, availability, they now need to be security experts and policy experts at the time. And they look at a policy and they do their best at reverse engineering that to map it to security, to the engineering requirements. And they bang their heads of like, it wouldn't take a lot of imagination to find a scenario of deploying an application and finding midway that one of the resources you needed, one of the resources specified by the policy, is non-compliant. So as you're rolling out this new application, whatever organization you work with, be it, and it's the first time it's going to market or it's an update, if that deploy, if that rollout of that application, one of the criteria of the policy is not met, it blocks the deployment, which leaves things in an overall state of inconsistency halfway, which will result in downtime, which will result on degraded experience. And is it better to be compliant or is it better to be not operational? Sure, we can abide by the policy. We ensured if this had certain number of vulnerabilities, it didn't reach production. But wouldn't it have been better for it to reach production and somehow get sandboxed or guardrailed, understanding that exemption as it was actively patched? So engineers are quite clever, and they're always going to find a way around. They're going to above, through the side, every time that a computer says, no, you cannot come through this way. And that's further exasperated when updates to policy are desired. Like maybe you're getting a penetration testing and something goes wrong and you form this new policy and could be Amazon Web Services, all your S3 buckets need to be encrypted, and that could be considered a breaking change. And you could say, well, sure, what if we just provide warnings, at least like a heads up, instead of gating it, at least for the less important issues or new emerging policies as those changes happen. But that it will only work if everyone actually looks at it. It's not just writing the document, but if folks just are on about their job every day, we go back to the elevator situation. How do they keep that rule book updated? How they even like load it in their heads? It's almost a full-time job of keeping up with this set of warnings. So if you've adopted DevOps, and chances are, if you're on that journey, you may have heard the term GitOps, or at least like continuous integration and continuous delivery. Is anyone actually looking at the warnings? Who studies the results of the logs every time there's a deploy or every time there's a build? Anyone? Not really. If you are, you could be missing the point of CI/CD, which is being able to trust the status and the activity. But not here to throw stones today. Like going back to the promises, to the imaginary friends of what the promised land may look like. Easy would mean visible. It has to be communicated. It has to be easily consumable, testable, updatable, and measurable. Nothing really new under the sun, but someone has unwittingly solved these problems elsewhere. We just need to remind them and connect the different domains. The first thing to start off, if you're doing policy as code, is putting it in version control, Git or GitHub. And then from there, making that visible to everyone. So the term inner source. How do we bring that institutional knowledge and capture it and operationalize it, and allowing anyone within the organization's walled gardens, employees, suppliers, to see that policy in that repository? And it's not giving visibility of all the threat monitoring rules or the intelligence away to them. You can keep those to yourself, but making the policy visible as code and artifacts are in version control and what gaps are there is often better than the downtime, the reverse engineering workarounds, or the opaque legacy solutions that look like spaghetti soup. If you're really brave, you may want to share it with the outside world. you will find that it finds the ability to work well with prospective suppliers and new business relationships without incurring in NDAs and whatnot. Uh, Widely distributed secrets are ultimately very expensive to maintain, difficult to handle, and only stay secret for so long. So policy is visible with GitOps and in Git, so it's visible to those that need to see it. Then we start looking at something like semantic versioning that no doubt you're using, but a quick recap on it. Semantic versioning, the first segment in semantics versioning, we see the one is indicating major versions, perhaps conflicting changes. And if we apply that to the context of policy, it could be a policy that expresses that all resources require a department level, like who's the owner. And that would help with things like cross charging. Who knows? Like an increment to that uh, field could be something that requires to be from a predetermined list rather than free text. So we're expanding this notion of policy. Then the second segment indicates things like minor changes, things that are easy to update and are not going to break anyone. An increment from there will look like you're correcting a spelling mistake that was done in the policy or a department name change. The third segment indicates path changes. So that'd be like fairly easy, like a no-brainer to keep up with. An increment in this field would be like adding more departments to the available options. So great, the policy is visible. It's in a repository now. It's versioned so people understand when changes have occurred. We can tack release notes every time there's an update in the versioning, and all the expectations are managed along that semantic versioning. So in software, we're used to handling dependencies. So what if this policy was just another dependency of the code? You might be unwittingly doing this to some degree, staking something like a dependency on your JavaScript package, perhaps, like ESLint. So we tack visible, communicable, and consumable like software. And then we go on to unit testing. And testing is somewhat of a dirty word. But in order to make this an asset everyone can depend on and also provide good examples, tests are essential to give. Fire alarm? All right, good to know. No panic. I was once in Hawaii at a ultra marathon race, and everyone's phone blurred up for a incoming missile. Yeah, incoming missile, and it was a test from the Department of Defense that had gone out to everyone. So yeah, the policy wasn't honored in that instance, or the policy's code was not enforceable. It was quite the situation. Within 5 minutes, we did get, hey, false alarm, no missiles, nothing to do. Uh, Great. Okay, so back to policy and keeping on making it easy. Everyone's confidence in the stability and the potential side effects of everyone involved, all the stakeholders, are trying to be like better grasped. So the consumers of the policy need to be able to test it themselves, talking about unit testing against the policy. Going back to that shifting left, it shortens the feedback loop. So as a bonus, you're finding your consumers able to rely on the artifact you're sharing with them. So taking out the home stretch is a dependency, so updating it's not different to anything else in software. You can use some magic like GitHub's Dependabot or meant to renovate and do that for you. Think like automatic pull requests, if you heard about those, tests, even automatic merging. I did say policy is dull, so if it's not the most energizing start of the day, you can tell me like a recent event that cost everyone in every industry what version of a certain logging Java doohickey where was everyone potentially running literally in every state. Log4j. You guys heard about that one? So all presentations in 2022, 2023 are contractually required to have some reference to Log4j, given given what that cost, even if it's almost entirely out of context. So I'm being compliant there, and including some memes about it. Hopefully, mid-year we can start to remove these. And just to point at a broadly scary look of a list of vulnerabilities in order of like commanding behavior through fear. Uh, you see a lot of scores 10, 9 and above. If you cyber and policy, it's all about ultimately like, and the reference to Log4j is situational awareness of your software supply chain is something your company's probably started to do to avoid being on the headlines, on media, and the news, having the negative press cycles pick up. So if policies are dependency, it's not a new problem. Like if in the software supply chain context, you might have started hearing about software bills of materials. The promise of having like list of ingredients. So that can help us measure compliance of like what packages are in there. So lots of ground there. Hopefully some of it sounds convincing. It's not some fictional utopia on PowerPoint. It's time to look at like how you might actually implement this. And like you didn't come in here to start the day wanting to see a million words in the slide or an emoji or two. So at this point, I can show you some code, maintain scope. We're going to talk about two things to prove it's not just technology or one tool. We've arbitrarily picked Terraform as a quite popular configuration management, system provisioning tool. It's open source, and then Kubernetes, which has become like the infrastructure interface that most modern applications get built on. But you could pick anything. Naturally, like we needed some tools, but we're somewhat lazy to invent new things here. So picking two other things that exist in open source. Chekhov will do that Terraform part, and Caverno will do the Kubernetes. So if you wanted to browse, here's an example GitHub organization. Like I don't want you to like read the whole thing or like try to grok the code on screen. It's just there to prove it's a real thing that's been prototyped, that you can check out, that you can consume, expand, share with the organization. So this is a sample view of the repository. The policies stored there. And here's a view of that policy that starts at version 1.0.0. And this policy requires a department label on all resources. As long as that's set, it doesn't matter what that is. We've written some tests for it, so the passing test cases are usable as a great example of what good and what bad looks like. We pushed the tag in Git, we've added release notes, we can sign it cryptographically to verify assurance. So Chris signed it there. Version 2 of the policy looks very similar, but now that department field has to be a predetermined list. Like before the test exists, release notes are written. 2.1 is where we notice and correct a spelling mistake for one of the options in the list of departments. 2.1.1, we've added a new department to the list. App 1 and Infra 1 in the system depend on version 1 of the policy, are not compliant with version 2, but how can we infer that? We've configured this to renovate automatically in code. So there's a new version of the policy. It's super obvious to update the dependency and reason against it. Clear feedback of where and where not you're compliant. You can see the pull requests, all the merges from the stakeholders, so you can measure the compliance of the policy. So if you're moving from app 2 and infra 2, they have that dependency. You could merge the open pull requests all the way to 2.1.1. And finally, app 3 and infra 3 are dependent on 2.1, and that gets a gold star from the CIO. There's a little bit of magic there. All of it's not pretty. It's like written bash. No judgment there, but it's not the worst code. It's probably worse. It does allow to test from my developer machine and into my pipeline my code against a particular version of policy. So yeah, that's an interesting bit. Um, the last piece of the puzzle is managing the life cycle of the policy and allowing multiple policies to be accepted and evaluated with a single runtime. A little bit of cheating because Kubernetes gives you something called admission controls. So it's not easy to get the same policy evaluation you would have in the cloud. Although it has its own policy code in Kubernetes, and uh, we're making some changes there. You may have noticed that the policy is designed and distributed. It lends itself to be reused in multiple clusters and multiple platforms, which brings cluster one, cluster two, um, all the automation. We use separate tooling, and then all you have captured in code is like compliant. It's the policy is all versioned. The CIO has visibility and context that has the awareness of what's going on. It's great. Like the one more thing that would be awesome if the policy carried a story of why it exists. What is it? Not what it ought to be, like its reason of existence. After all, your agile teams, if they're effective, they will reject anything they perceive as friction or slowing them down if they don't see value for it. So they need to understand the why. So it helps them understand if they're compliant, if they want to do something outside what the policy permits. They don't need any sort of exemption granted for this. They can have a well-reasoned and informed debate, defensible arguments with the rationale once it has that story. So if you're going through a stage of versions and then the risk informs the mitigations that's expressed there, maintained all in the code. So when the risk landscape changes as it continues to evolve, your policies can evolve with it. New regulation comes in, or your latest marketing strategy is changed and it's paying off, and you acquire more data as a result. So the policy that was good before that exists is no longer that great. Like the risk and the appetite stand still with it. So liken it to over provisioning. That's where like the real culture change is needed, and the execution of that is probably like an entire series of talk. But this is really on to you now. Like you can tell us if it's something that resonates with you. Love to chat more. But yeah, check out the code, talk to people, making like more than getting developers on board and like pull requests on like helping us grow and have traction if this is a movement. We really like to like find design partnerships, understand your use cases and desired outcomes of how can we do this policy as code and function of you, and start to swap this imaginary people for real people, you and the audience. The most important thing from our time together is precisely that, the relationships we establish, and thinking of it as a socio-technical system. If you invest, if you're going through a transformation and you invest solely in technology, you only get so far. If you think it's a people problem and you invest in training and upskill them, but don't do so with modern tooling, you also only get so far. So you have to do this too in conjunction because change is hard. So the one thing, just like the if you could retain one thing at all, is like purposeless policy is the same as a pointless policy. It's just words on a document. So bringing the story and that policy into life, letting it burst into a life of its own, and being something that we can all see, we can all understand, we can express, we can reason, is what gets us to a better place. Uh, Here's once again the repository to the code. Uh, Again, like risk has to be, or security has to be commensurate to the risk that exists. So does your investments in cybersecurity. Um, but yeah, that's the talk. Hopefully, you have found this informational, entertaining. Um, I'm I may not have all the answers. I'll take questions, but I do think we're at time. But yeah, more than answers. I'm here to have conversations and then exchange and learn from each other. So thank you very much once again. A great pleasure to be here. Beautiful place in the world, and looking forward to spending today and tomorrow with you. Thank you.
Yeah, man, come on up. Let's take some questions.
Please.
All right, so I kind of get writing policy, kind of like the full writing where you have throws and exceptions. Oh, sorry. I get this is all right. I get writing the. I don't think this is on. It was. It was. Yeah. No. All right, so
You
I
have a very deep voice and great vocal range. You're filling the
all
time
right.
anyway.
Oh, there we go. Yes. So I get writing the policy um, as whatever happens normally, and you have the throws and exceptions for edge cases, things that might happen that are unusual. Uh, but what I was kind of I still didn't quite get clear in terms of thinking of dependencies and inheritances. Going back to my student days as kind of like OOP, object oriented programming.
Mm-hmm.
Um, how do you do that in terms of policy? Because it seems kind of hard to express that as code per
Mm-hmm.
se. I mean, could you expand like how do you
Yeah.
make that readable for not us as people who set policies, but kind of translating that what we want to communicate to development
Yeah.
teams to other
Yeah.
technical people.
That's a great question. Analogous to object-oriented programming, you have classes and you have objects that are instances of those classes, like manifestations, right? So being just like plain, if it was not object-oriented, if your policy becomes code, and that is just like putting the curly braces around it, you're not instantiating like the multiple variances of that policy in existence. So turning it into a class and having having that called out and saying, okay, a hierarchy of policies and that composition where a later semantic version of like 211, you could have a dependency on like the baseline as 1.0. So that's what we mean by like establishing like that relationship as a dependency of like you can have a baseline and then the multiple variances that fork from there would at least need to depend on 1.0. Does that conceptually make sense?
So you're describing like a polymorphism,
Yes.
right?
If we could please use the mic because we have people online.
Sorry. So what you're describing is kind of a polymorphism where you can have several inputs, several different kinds of inputs into one policy, depending on condition of what actually is passed into
Correct.
it.
Correct.
Okay, it's an interesting concept. I don't know unless you are regulated or somebody in there who has a technical background as to understand. Like, yes, not all of us went to CS school and so forth, but I definitely would like to have some like resources and so forth I could pass on so that
Okay.
people can get it. Because I kind of get it because I have a CS background, but I know a lot of people wouldn't.
Yeah, and it's a steep learning curve because it is bringing a lot of like heavy computer science into a domain that has been probably more lawyerly and more prosaic. But yeah, just like another form of analogous to describing that without like talking about object-oriented programming or polyformism is thinking of input lists, right? Like you're building software and you're making the policy a dependency is all the list of libraries and packages you're putting in there and being able to call it out when you're assembling at build time, saying like we're depending on this policy for this particular release. Thank you. Great question.
I just have a quick question.
Please,
This is
question
more
away.
on a consulting side, but with ChatGPT and the risks of employees sharing or verifying code, what's your recommendations on how best to tackle this in terms of businesses adopting this to their corporate policy as well as cybersecurity?
Wow, that's quite the question. See if I can do it justice. And lots of thoughts. Still forming an opinion, and I think it's nascent. It's growing so fast, and we're seeing it like people relying less on Google and opting for like having a Chat GPT window open all day. If if it's the place people are seeking information and the organization doesn't allow it, people are gonna attempt to circumvent that, right? Like they're gonna open it up on their phone and they're not gonna access it from the company network. They're gonna access it on the over the 5G and seek information there. It's important to have segmentation and isolation. If it's used as a tool for, again, information gathering, um, and ChatGPT, unless like the company has decided to like wrap around it and say like, hey, we're going to have ChatGPT for all our knowledge bases and have crawled that data. If that's the path, like having segmentation and say zero trust, like really like a hard mapping of what the guardrails of the system is, so there's no information leakage, but probably timely to start gathering the people together and having the conversation of like which way do we want to utilize and rely as opposed to oppose it, uh, before it proliferates and it's something that people just, I mean, becomes their day to day. Thank you.
Sorry, at this time we need to move forward. So he is going to be around. Please meet with Andres and ask him more questions if you'd like. Love the focus that you did during our alert. Thank you very much.